Welcome. Welcome officially to our fifth session of the virtual lecture series, Expanded Documentary, Ecologies of Images, Images of Ecology. Welcome back at the series, which is part of the BMBF-funded research project, Digital Documentary Practices, Topical Paradigm Shifts, and the Potential of Emerging Practices to Participate in Public Discourse. And a most heartily welcome to all of you joining us on a most exciting topic, the possible worlds of VR. And of course, a special thanks to Mandy Rose, who's our special guest tonight. I'm really excited about this talk. But actually, how I prepared for today's lecture, hence when having a recap of what we have been discussing in the previous sessions, I had a bit of a roller coaster of feelings. Talking about our plans tonight, a colleague of mine asked me which topic we are addressing in this session. And when I told her that we are entering the possible worlds of VR, this is the title of tonight's presentation. When I told her that we are discussing virtualities and possibilities of VR again, her reaction was, okay, once more virtual reality. Still, I thought you were addressing documentary and eco-documentary. At first, this response irritated me a bit, and I started questioning myself and what we are doing here. I thought things like, have we as organizers and hosts maybe lost focus, or rather, has the lecture series developed in a completely different direction than we had originally intended in our conception phase? Because yes, it's true, when we are looking back, in our first session, Liz Miller introduced us to augmented documentary. To be more precise, augmented documentary is critical place-based learning and the realization of central concepts wandering in wastegapes, which was about augmented reality, but also a lots of digital layerings, which we will recover today. And yes, Florian Mundhenke gave us in his presentation a comprehensive overview over the history of VR, its theory and previous applications, some of them highly complex constellations. Stefan Werning then invited us on an excursion into game theory and in how far this relates to emerging documentary practices, a topic which at first sight might lead into a different direction than the announced ones at first sight, and which is not too eco-documentary either. And finally, last week, Patricia Zimmerman and Dale Hudson once again thought with us through documentaries augmented realities, and though they explicitly addressed the discomfort of VR proper, with its heavy headsets, for example, and the uncanny valley, still VR was lurking underneath their argument too. So, are we still on the right track? Simply looking back on the titles might give us a misleading impression of what we are doing here. And still, so let's rewrite once again. Actually, when setting up the series and inviting colleagues and friends, we intended to tackle some of the essential issues at the intersection, or rather junction, of media and ecology, of mediatization and environment. We aimed at facing together with you as a community how the expanding field of documentary can contribute to ways out of dead ends in mediatization in times of crisis. And we hoped to explore different dimensions of ecologies of images and also images of ecology, and to critically engage with both concepts. Tackling some of the essential issues at this intersection, often experimental ones, practices could contribute to a way out of all this mess, we thought. In this context, for example, we hosted, we invited as hosts guests who would like to invite us then to explore with us different dimensions of ecologies of images. Being aware that media and mediatization are not the same and need to be distinguished, we were all nonetheless interested in the intersection and how they relate. So we started from the premises that the documentary is so much more than merely an epistemic genre, and rather it is imbued with a transformative impetus and an awareness of issues going alongside with politics and their poetics of representation, and also representation and the more representational, as we will see, because there is more to it. And finally, of course, the living such as in living documentary, but also as anything which is inhabited by us and other beings. This having said, my emotional roller coaster slowed down a bit, going a bit deeper into what we have been discussing in the last months, the ontoepistemological interminglings, the complexity of themes, the dynamics, transformative momentums of configurations, of constellations, of assemblages. All this digging deeper gave me the feeling that we are exactly on the right track. Thinking through the previous sessions again, which might have keywords such as VR or AR or game in the title, but which went much deeper than only discussing technologies or applications. And yes, I think in all these sessions, we really revisited very valuable tracks. Because what is the aim and the scope and the impetus of the series? And also alongside tonight's presentation. As always, and also today, we are going to embrace the complex, the messy, the interminglements and the networking, the dimensions of expanded documentary. In this case, especially actuality and virtuality, its possibilities and potentials. With our double lens of images of ecology and ecologies of images, which must not be confused, we will also see into documentary's past. We will see what is happening at the present, and we are glimpsing at the future. Foremost, however, we may be excited about opening up discourses for more trans and non-disciplinary exchange. And in fact, as the topics we have dived in so far, and that we will continue exploring today and in the next sessions, have proved, the interactive, which means interactivity, interaction and participation, polyphony and multiperspectivity, the immediate, the immersive, and the longue duree, the deep or the meta, the more than. All these dimensions which need to be addressed in our times of polycrisis and which are so essential to documentary will help us to think through things. Yes, the more than. And finally, this more than, which will be one of the anchor points in Mandy lecture today, the more than human, but also the more than representational, directly lead us to our tonight's, or wherever you're joining us from, lecture. This having said, we are mostly completely in today's lecture theme, the possible worlds of VR documentary. As Mandy writes in her abstract and in the bow water of the third way of VR, many scholars have been concerned with the tension between the platform and documentary's critical role in relation to social reality. The criticality of VR. That's exactly what Mandy will introduce us to. That is what Mandy will help us to explore and to see VR worlds as critical spaces, analyzing case studies of works that conjure temporal imaginaries of more than human worlds. Probably we could imagine not a better guide into this than Mandy. Who's Mandy? Probably most of you know. Mandy is not only professor of documentary and digital cultures at UW Bristol, she's also co-investigator in the Virtual Realities Immersive Documentaries Encounters project from 2017 to 2020, and currently the UKRI My World program. Many of you might know also as co-convener of IDOCS, and in her role as member of the executive board of the Pervasive Media Studies, and a member director of the community-owned investigative newspaper, The Bristol Cable. Her research examines the relationship between technology, cultural form, and audience experience with evolving documentary. And probably most of you have already one of her writings, which appeared in, among others, Studies in Documentary Film, World Records, and Convergence. Or you might have a copy of her seminal book she edited together with Sandra Gaudenzi and Judith Aston in 2017, iDocs, the evolving practice of interactive documentary. So there could be many, many other things I could address now, but Mandy, we are so honored to have you here. So I just leave the stage to you.
Thanks so much. So yeah, thanks, Anna. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here. I haven't heard all the talks in this series, but it was great to attend Dale and Patty's talk last week, and I was so interested by the threads in their talk that I think I'm picking up on tonight. My paper is based on a chapter that I'm writing for a new collection that Kate Nash and Deanne Williams are editing for Routledge, a handbook of documentary. So I'm writing this chapter, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share ideas from the chapter with you this evening, and look forward to your hearing your thoughts and comments. So okay, I'll share my screen and I'll get going. Share the screen. So I've got quite a few slides, more words than I'd like, no moving images, and apologies for that. So what's the time? Just checking, 7:20. Okay, all right, I'll bash on. So in this paper, I'm concerned with the ways that documentary can contribute to the deep cultural shifts that are needed to challenge extractivism, respond to racial and climate injustice, and move towards post-carbon futures. I'm going to look at some case studies of projects that harness the affordances of immersive media for their potential to engage participants with temporal imaginaries and more than human worlds. I'll consider how these projects develop and diverge from documentary traditions, and suggest ways that they reframe the human perspective and historicize the present, and in doing so reflect and seek to produce new subjectivities. I'm going to focus on some distinctive features of today's consumer-facing virtual and mixed reality, which we all know is moving very fast. And with the Apple Vision Pro announced a couple of weeks ago, we can't even, it's not even as simple as talking about VR and AR. We can now see those combined in one device. So anyway, I'm going to be talking about the fast-moving space of today's consumer-facing VR and MR technologies, and discuss ways in which documentary makers are harnessing immersion, spatial storytelling, post-lenticular visualities, by which I mean ways of image capture beyond the lens, and embodied experience. The VR and MR case studies I'll look at demonstrate a variety of sensory potentials that are still novel for documentary, and I'll think about ways that we might theorize these haptic experiences of nonfiction. So producers have been drawn to VR for the powerful, well, I believe, for the powerful feeling of presence that the platform offers in relation to real-world content. The politics of VR affect, particularly in relation to distant human others, have been analysed and critiqued by people, including myself. This feels like a bit of a revisionist paper that I'm about to give. But in this paper, I'm interested in how VR's effective potential is being deployed by some producers within mediated encounters across time and with more than human others. I'll consider how these encounters might operate not just to provoke feeling in the individual immersant, instead to trouble dominant structures of feeling and support the emergence of new formations of consciousness. I've bracketed off for this paper questions of the environmental impact of the tech itself, which I know are pressing issues of concern, and which I'll address elsewhere. So first section, documentary and the re-emergence of VR. While generations of new technology, the coming of sound, the introduction of color, the use of the Steadicam have each brought new dimensions to the immersive experience of cinema, VR also develops immersion in distinctive ways, where the experience of watching a movie or looking at a painting has been compared to looking through the Renaissance scholar Alberti's window. The experience of VR has been compared to falling through that window so that one feels as if one is situated within the frame. Like cinema, VR plays a trick on our sensory apparatus. When the computer displays a panoramic 3D image which changes in a lifelike way as we turn our head in VR, our visual experience produces the feeling that I'm in the place that I see on screen, even while my bodily sensation, my proprioception, tells me that I'm in situ where I put the headset on. This psychological effect is known as presence, and it's regarded by many as the characteristic sensory experience of VR. I guess you've all got yourselves across my slides, so I will move. Do I move the little line of people? Do I control that, Anna, or can anyone else control that?
The original music should be on now, so we can hear the sound.
No, it's not that. It's more that the little row of people, you all and me, are obscuring words on my slide, and I'm not quite sure how to. Oh, okay. Well, I've minimized that list of people. Okay, I'm not sure if you have as well.
It's clear for me. It's all good.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, the documentary value of immersion and presence were promoted by early adopters of VR, most notoriously by producer Chris Milk in his much debated 2015 TED Talk. VR, Milk argued, feels like the truth. You feel present in the world you're inside and present with the people you're inside it with. While Milk's notorious claim for an intrinsic link between VR and empathy has been contested, his case for VR as a platform for nonfiction, meanwhile, has proved compelling. Immersion and presence can together be seen as driving the decisive take-up of VR in what I've called an immersive turn within nonfiction, as they intersect with a long-standing interest among some documentarians in the feeling of being there, the very title of direct cinema pioneer Ricky Leacock's biography. Sorry. Okay, so the themes of early VR nonfiction show how producers looked to the nascent platform to provide a feeling of presence in relation to people and places remote from the global north. This trend had its corollary in relation to more than human themes too, with a raft of 360 video projects whose rationale was to offer close encounters with creatures in the wild. 700 Sharks that you can see here, top left, exemplifies this tendency. So 700 Sharks promoted itself as a virtual dive with an invitation to experience a thrilling adventure on the atoll of Fakarava with Lawrence Ballista, marine biologist and underwater photographer, 30 men, 700 sharks, and you. However, as William Oricchio has stressed, VR is an imprecise term encompassing divergent technologies, interfaces, and experiences which we need to disaggregate in order to identify the emergent possibilities of the medium. Reflecting its moniker cinematic VR, 360 video has a shared ontology with film, essentially a video panorama, as Urukio has said. The content is fixed in duration and arrangement. So in contrast, VR works based on forms of digital imaging can have the openness characteristic of computerization. LiDAR, for instance, an acronym for light imaging detection and ranging, is a form of lensless image capture technology developed in the 1960s that uses lasers to judge distance and depth. Comprised of millions of data points, known as a point cloud, content can be rendered algorithmically to respond in real time to the shifting gaze of the immersant, but also to other movements, standing, walking, reaching out. In what's known as 6 degrees of freedom, the immersant is able to move around and interact within the VR world with a level of what Noni de la Peña has called behavioral realism. So what might these interactive and multisensory affordances of VR mean for the depiction of more than human worlds? Between 2015 and 2020, the UK agency Marshmallow Laser Feast developed 3 VR non-fiction projects exploring how forms of digital imaging and interaction, novel to documentary, might provide fresh encounters with the more than human. The first work in this informal trilogy, In the Eyes of the Animal, arose from a residency in the Grisdale Forest in England's Lake District. Marshmallow Laser Feast Robin McNicholas has explained how the team sought to explore the sensory perspectives of the animals that lived there by taking sonic samples for the soundtrack and a 360 LiDAR scan and a digital sample of the environment too. Combining LiDAR with photogrammetry and informed by what's known about animal sight, Marshmallow Laser Feast developed expressive visuals suggesting how 3 species, dragonfly, owl, and frog, might see the forest. Within the VR headset, the participant is invited to choose one of the 3 animal perspectives and finds herself immersed in an entrancing visual world, seeing as if through the eyes of one of these woodland creatures. Meanwhile, she experiences bodily sensation through a subpack, a device worn as a backpack, which converts audio into tactile outputs. In the dragonfly section of the work, she experiences a buzzing sensation. In the frog section, a deep throbbing, etc. In the Eyes of the Animal was my first introduction to the incorporation of LiDAR within a documentary experience, and its unfamiliar visual renderings and 360-degree view produced a compelling impression of an other-than-human perspective. LiDAR joins a generation of technologies of image capture, time-lapse, super slow motion, high resolution, high frame rate, drones, GoPros that have been harnessed for non-fiction in the 21st century, being used notably within natural history filmmaking. Ji-hoon Kim has considered the expanded visions offered by such emerging camera technologies in relation to the genealogy of the documentary camera. He notes how major currents, theories, and figures within 20th century documentary, from Vertov's Kino Eye to Rouche's living camera, 16mm handheld camera to cell phone video, have promoted an association between the camera and the human eye. I was just talking about Ji-hoon Kim, looking at the current within documentary where there's an association between the camera and the human eye. At the same time, Kim identifies a countercurrent at play, an alternative conception of the camera, which documentary pioneer Vertov also articulated as a device with the ability to gather and record impressions in a manner wholly different than the human eye. Kim notes how filmmakers from Ivans and Ruttman to Godfrey Reggio have engaged with the camera as a revelatory force, able to bring about more than human visual possibilities. So while Kim complicates any simple opposition between the 20th century documentary camera as prosthetic for the human eye and 21st century as an age of machine vision, he acknowledges a growing profusion of imaging technologies that don't involve a lens and a person looking through a viewfinder. For Kim, drones and GoPros offer a denaturalized view on our human world, or a picture of the world in which the human is decentered and instead interacts with animals and objects on the same plane of existence. This denaturalization of the human perspective is intensified within the immersive experience of VR. While natural history programs have deployed sequences that offer alternative visualities, framed by the explanation of a human narrator, In the Eyes of the Animal doesn't offer to translate its visual and oral content, which is a wordless soundtrack of animal and forest sounds. Deployed within In the Eyes of the Animal, the lensless technology of LiDAR, with its 360-degree scope and detection of aspects of the environment that would be invisible to a human eye, doesn't just decenter, but replaces human visuality. Entering the work feels like a temporary estrangement from human subjectivity. While the visuals and soundtrack are arresting, these are not the only sensory dimensions of the experience. In cinematic VR works, while the viewer has the illusion of presence in the image world, the body outside the headset plays no part. In the Eyes of the Animals, by contrast, brings a form of proprioception into the experience in the form of the vibrations produced by the haptic jacket. And when the piece was first exhibited in England's Grisdale Forest, it was presented at the end of a forest walk with physical elements of the forest, the moss, the grass, the forest floor itself, integrated into the experience through touch and smell, creating the type of hybrid physical-digital experience known as mixed reality. Within non-fiction VR projects, then, we can see multiple sensory registers displacing the visuality that has dominated media to date, reflecting the primary of sight that can be traced right back to the invention of perspective in the Renaissance. 2 years later, in TreeHugger Wawona, Marshmallow Laserfeast developed their exploration of the multisensory potential of MR in a work about the Californian native giant sequoia tree. Donning a VR headset, the participant leans into a cavity inside a foam model of a section of a sequoia tree. Scent is dispensed within the headset, custom made to evoke the forest. Visuals show a giant sequoia, scanned through LiDAR, first seen from outside, then from within. As computer graphics visualize the flows of water passing up through the trunk to the leaves, the embodied experience of hugging the tree, hugging the model of the tree, melds with the visuals and the scent, and the immersive feels as if swept up in the life-sustaining processes within this huge ancient being. In the 20th century, non-fiction media informed us, showed us remote things and places, enabled us to hear recordings of human voices and of faraway locations, anchored in the explanations of a human narrator. In cinematic VR experiences, despite the discourse of being there, the disembodied eye is still the locus of knowledge, while the rest of the body plays no part. In TreeHugger Wawona, by contrast, interactive media technology engages the body in multiple sensory registers, with sight, sense, and touch all at play. When I experienced the work, while fully aware that I was embracing a model of a giant sequoia tree, the embodied act of that hug produced a feeling of connection to another species that took me by surprise and changed me, the virtual experience affecting how I've gone on to feel and think about trees. So how might we theorize this type of sensory engagement with media? Here, phenomenological film scholarship provides a significant reference point and resource. Building on Merleau-Ponty's philosophy, phenomenological accounts by Vivian Sobchak, Laura Marks, among others, place the body and embodied spectatorship at the heart of all cinematic experience. While it's commonplace to recognize that viewers experience a visceral relationship to certain cinematic genres, horror, pornography, sentimental content, most obviously. A phenomenological account shows how all cinema operates on us through the body. Our experience, as Marx argues, of cinema is mimetic, or an experience of bodily similarity to the audiovisual images we take in. Cinema is not merely a transmitter of signs, it bears witness to an object and transfers the presence of that object to viewers. Marx defines mimesis from the Greek mimesthai, to imitate, as a form of indexical representation in which one represents a thing by acting like it through a particular material contact at a particular moment, such as that between a child at play and an aeroplane. Like the child holding the plane, material contact with the model tree in TreeHugger provides a sensory connection to an imaginary object without the mediation of language. Marx draws the image of the child at play in the aeroplane from Walter Benjamin and discusses how the Frankfurt School valued sensuous knowledge as a form of non-alienated experience. For Adorno and Horkheimer, mimesis is a form of yielding to one's environment rather than dominating it, a radical alternative to the controlling distance from the environment so well served by vision. So Marx calls the forms of knowledge derived from embodiment tactile epistemologies. These, she writes, conceive of knowledge as something gained not on the model of vision with its connotations of dominance, but through physical contact. Tactile epistemology provides an apt conceptual framework through which to consider the forms of knowledge production at play within the haptic, multisensory modalities of VR nonfiction. Movement is, of course, a fundamental means through which we inhabit, explore, and know the physical world. 6 Degrees of Freedom VR platforms incorporate forms of movement unfamiliar from 20th century media. Through positional tracking, virtual environments can be mapped onto physical space so that a participant can move around while in VR, and the virtual world within the headset will respond to their real-world actions. We Live in an Ocean of Air 2018, the final part of Marshmallow Laserfeast's informal trilogy, further develops their exploration of multisensory VR and of the connectedness between people and the more than human world, with movement and the sharing of virtual space with others at the heart of the experience. We Live in an Ocean of Air revisits the giant sequoia tree and the forest of the US Pacific Northwest in which it grows. A 15-minute experience accommodating to up to five people at a time. Visitors are kitted out with a VR headset, heart rate monitor, and breath sensors. Within the work, they encounter and explore a forest, represented through LiDAR scanning, and experience their connection with their environment in a unique way, as visual renderings of their inhalation and exhalation manifest what is usually invisible, the porousness between the human self, the air around us, and other living beings. These works by Marshmallow Laserfeast provide experiences of tactile epistemology, with meaning emerging as the immersant explores their media environment and pays attention to the effects that their multisensory interaction produces. Knowledge isn't gained through mastery, but through entanglement, even vulnerability. The embrace, which is the central user experience of TreeHugger, provides a particularly fitting instance of this form of knowledge production that Marx has called a compassionate involvement with the world, or Michael Tausig has termed a yielding knowing. So I'm going to have a quick visit to the Umwelt, immersive VR and the Umwelt. In 1909, German Baltic zoologist Jacob von Quetzalcoatl coined the term Umwelt to describe the distinct life world of each living creature. The term draws on the German word for environment, but the concept goes further than describing the distinctive surroundings within which different species live. Instead, it proposes a dynamic in which the life world of each animal is not experienced through, but constructed by and in response to their conceptual apparatus. As the spider weaves its thread, every subject, Wexkull wrote, every subject spins his relations to certain characters of the things around him and weaves them into a firm web that carries his existence. According to Wexkull, each animal lives within its own sensory bubble, alive to the features within its environment that its sensory apparatus and activities engage, but oblivious to others. In his early and often cited explanation of the Umwelt, one Wexkull conjures the world of the tick, hanging on a grass stem for perhaps years at a time, in wait for a passing mammal, responsive to precise forms of heat, touch, and smell, its distinct island of the senses. The concept of Umwelt has recently been gaining attention for its potential to upturn the dominant human view that what we see and feel is the world. In the final chapter of her study of animals and non-fiction cinema regarding life, Belinda Smaill introduces Wexkull's concept and considers the possibility of producing a non-human filmic world. For Smaill, the relational concept of Umwelt fundamentally challenges the ontology of the photographic image. And here's a quote: with no objects that are stable or consistent across different Umwelten and no shared physical field, the discourse of the real that structures the expectations and institutions of documentary must be rethought. Considering how the concept of Umwelt might be transposed into cinematic representation is for Smaill a revolutionary proposition. While the cinematic image is fundamentally challenged to reflect diverse Umwelten, the affordances of 6 degrees of freedom VR lend themselves to the task, with algorithmic design and interactive experience capable of giving expression to the relational being in the world at the heart of Wexkull's concept. In the Marshmallow Laserfish projects we can see that I've discussed, we can see how post-lenticular visualities, multisensory registers, and immersive interaction hold promise for exploring this radical concept. Here, documentary doesn't derive its authority from its objectivity and fixedness, from a filmmaker who turns his camera on the world, but from multiplicity, subjectivity, and relationality. These projects suggest how immersive documentary might fulfill Smaill's vision of a media that can throw into relief human ways of knowing and perceiving, triggering a fuller understanding of the specificity of human perception rather than seeing it as universal. So I'm going to move on to talking a little about VR documentaries and the temporal imagination. So while the projects I've discussed might trouble anthropocentrism, immersive media has potential to trouble other dominant paradigms too. A growing body of immersive nonfiction works engage the temporal imagination in ways that are novel for documentary and, I'll argue, encourage a critical distance towards the here and now. While the present, the past, and the relationship between the two have been central concerns for documentary, the future is less often its subject. This is in part a formal problem, how to reflect events that haven't yet taken place within the framework of documentary, how to reconcile documentary's truth claims with the speculative work of imagining a time yet to come. In non-fiction VR projects, however, the future has emerged as a recurrent focus. Paradoxically, it's the spatial character of VR, the feeling that it gives you of being immersed in place, that supports temporal exploration, the illusion of context shift that VR engenders, opening the possibility of bringing the participant not just into a media encounter with another place, but also with another time. An early speculative non-fiction VR work that garnered considerable international attention, Biidabaan First Light, was produced by Anishinaabe artist Lisa Jackson. On donning the headset, the immersant finds herself in a CGI Toronto that has been overtaken by nature. Trees grow through the pavements and plants sprout from the infrastructure. As the immersant in the experience, at first it feels unsettling to be plunged into what looks like a post-apocalyptic scenario. But as you grow used to the dawn light and begin to explore, you notice people traveling by canoe, vegetables being cultivated on the roofs of buildings, and realize that the world you find yourself in isn't one of violence or desperation. A form of urban life is flourishing. Indigenous artists have embraced VR, and Biidabaan is among 40 projects documented on the Fourth VR website by Keziah Wallace and Miriam Ross. Alongside Lisa Jackson's speculative work, titles including VR Future Farm Scrapers, Along the River of Space-Time, and Future Dreaming show that VR has provided a fertile media environment for explorations of Indigenous futurism, with its agenda, as Wallace and Ross put it, to rework and dismantle colonial narratives. As you look around in Biidabaan, you hear statements in what you learn to be Wendat, Huron, Kanyen Haka, Mohawk, and Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, the languages of the original inhabitants of what was called Toronto. Your exploratory gaze triggers voices which then appear as written texts and in English translations, offering glimpses of Indigenous thought systems and troubling a linear conception of time. The effect is to reframe the Toronto of today within a deep historical flow, reminding the immersant that the modern city is a creation rooted in a violent and destructive colonial history. In a world of many worlds, Maria de la Cadena and Mario Blazer discuss how, as the possibility of climate catastrophe intensifies, Indigenous perspectives are gaining a new purchase on the Western imagination. The world of the powerful, the world of the powerful is now sensitive to the plausibility of its own destruction in a way that may compare with the threat imposed on worlds sentenced to disappearance in the name of the common goods of progress, civilization, development, and liberal inclusion. This era too will pass, Biidabaan reminds us. The Changing Same, an American pilgrimage made by Joe Brewster, Yasmin Aliat, and Michelle Stevenson. An American pilgrimage engages VR for Afrofuturist themes. This ambitious work, envisaged in 3 parts, is a collaboration between Aliat, Emmy Award-winning immersive director, co-founder of Scatter, a company that has pioneered volumetric nonfiction storytelling, and multi-award-winning documentarians Brewster and Stevenson. In 2019, Brewster and Stevenson made a short film for CBS about Claude Neal, a 23-year-old farmhand who was the victim of a spectacle lynching in Marianna, Florida in 1934. The Changing Same revisits that dire historical episode in what the producers describe as an artivist virtual reality work that brings users on a journey through time, traveling with those whose lived experiences included slavery, lynching, and mass incarceration, and ending in an Afrofuturist tomorrow to confront and heal our generational wounds. Episode 1, The Dilemma, premiered in the New Frontiers section of the Sundance Film Festival in 2021 and won the Tribeca Immersive Award that year. Grounded in the real, both through its historical reference and through a visual grammar that incorporates volumetric capture of people and of sites, cypress trees, a dirt road, where the historical events took place. The producers combined these with computer-generated images to create the magic realist effect. The character of Umwelten, who guides the immersant through the experience, draws on Mariana-born poet L. Lamar Wilson, who became aware of this lynching in his hometown when he was a high school student and has dedicated himself to the work of memorializing Neil's death. Episode 1 travels through time, positioning the immersant alongside Lamar Wheaton in a heated contemporary incident in which he is wrongly arrested, and a parallel event in the 19th century when a free black man is unjustly apprehended. Then on into an Afrofuturist space-time in which the immersant encounters the opposing but playful goddess-like figure of Harriet, who asks them about their commitment to making this journey. The changing same then, like Biidabaan, is a work of polytemporality, moving backwards and forwards across time to confront the continuum of racial injustice in America and show how the past is never really the past, but informs our present and future. So VR worlds of space as spaces of critique. What observations about immersive documentary arise from looking across the two currents with immersive documentary that I've discussed? While nonfiction producers rush to embrace VR, scholars have pointed to a tension between VR and documentary's critical role in relation to social reality. For Bolter and Grusin, virtual reality is immersive in the sense that it's a medium whose purpose is to disappear. And this quality of VR, the feeling of being within a world rather than observing a representation of reality, has been seen as at odds with the work of producing a critical stance. VR has been linked to a privileging of feeling over thought. I'm thinking here of William Oricchio, and to the repression of reflexivity in the immersant, thinking of Kate Nash's writing, with the illusion of presence regarded as closing down an appropriate awareness of distance from and privilege in relation to the subject of VR documentary. These are valid and significant concerns about VR, particularly in relation to the representation of contemporary people and social reality. But I'd suggest that the case studies I'm pointing to counter this problem, taking advantage of the immersive quality of VR in ways that engender criticality. The embodied encounters created by Marshmallow Laser Feast develop a critique of anthropocentrism by decentering human perspectives and drawing attention to our entanglement with other species. Speculative works, Biidabaan and The Changing Same, presuppose a critical approach to the present. As a documentary platform, VR has been the focus of particular critical attention for its orientation towards emotion. Encouraged by Chris Milk's empathy machine rhetoric, VR was taken up in the tradition of what Brian Winston has called the victim documentary, the feeling of being there harnessed for projects which stage virtual encounters with suffering others, those affected by war, on the brink of famine 2016, Ebola survivors in Waves of Grace 2015, victims of human trafficking in Traffic 2016. These works have been critiqued for their emphasis on an individualistic and self-serving emotional response, what Lisa Nakamura has brilliantly called the feeling good about feeling bad. While Milk's argument there is an inherent link between VR and empathy is deterministic and refutable, his underlying insight about the effective resonance of VR experience holds true. In the case studies I've discussed, the producers harnessed that effective potential of VR in order to promote a critical attitude. Both Afrofuturism and indigenous futurism are creative practices that have emerged to acknowledge and grapple with the persistence of colonial and racial violence, harnessing imaginative time travel to highlight deep cultural patterns and drawing on indigenous and African cosmologies in imagined alternatives. Immersive time travels such as Biidabaan and The Changing Same show how VR documentary can facilitate what we might think of as a longue duree historical perspective that can encourage critical awareness of forces at play in the present in order to support the generation of alternative futures. Biidabaan stages an experience in which the immersant moves from being anxious in the face of a post-apocalyptic scenario to feeling a kind of ease in an imagined future in which nature and culture are a new kind of balance, a novel affective experience which invites a reflexive attitude. In episode 1 of The Changing Same, when the immersant finds herself sitting in the back of a police car alongside Umwelten, wrongfully arrested, the situation provokes powerful, disturbing feelings. But these in themselves aren't the point of the work. The producer's aim is to lever that feeling towards a new position of responsibility for the historical narrative. In an interview for XR Must, the producers explain the nature of the dilemma that gives the work its title, that they want immersants to face. Are you going to be conscious and aware, the work asks, and make the decision to stay and join the rewriting of our common narrative? Or do you prefer to bury it all and leave? While the project does then depend on an engagement with feeling, we might think about its operation conceptually through the lens of what Raymond Williams called structures of feeling. That is, feeling not as a uniquely personal emotion, but understood as a historical and cultural phenomenon. For Williams, feeling is also not a concept distinct from thought, rather one entangled with it. The term is difficult, Williams explains, but feeling has chosen to emphasize a distinction from more formal concepts of worldview or ideology. We're concerned with meanings and values as they are actively lived and felt, not feeling against thought, but thought as felt and feeling as thought, practical consciousness of a present kind in a living and interrelating community. So through these case studies, I've tried to show how VR nonfiction is evolving and how the distinctive qualities of the platform that align themselves with documentary's work of criticality are becoming more apparent. Futurism has emerged as a recurrent theme, with immersive time travels such as Biidabaan and The Changing Same, providing a form of critical distance on the present by foregrounding the longue duree of racial and colonial injustice. Encounters with more than human lifeworlds in projects such as TreeHugger and In the Eyes of the Animals take advantage of media embodiment and interactivity to trouble anthropocentrism. Embodied experiences displace vision as the locus of knowledge, with forms of sensuous and tactile epistemology, replacing the mastery of sight with forms of yielding knowing. While the case studies I've discussed engage feeling, they do so, I believe, in support of new formations of consciousness, constituting resources of hope, another Raymond Williams phrase, in relation to the multiple crises of climate and social injustice that we face. So thanks. I'll unshare my slides.